This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, great. Yeah, the recording started. Yeah, we were started with Spring Core module, right? Spring Core. So Spring Core and Spring Context, we have two are available from the Spring Core jar file and context jar file. And here we are discussing that this core module is having these two modules. Okay, Spring Core module we are discussing, and it has these two modules. And here they given the support like IOC container support. We have IOC container support. They are like containers, embedded containers we have. So built-in containers. The benefits with these containers, the benefits with these containers, the benefit with these containers, they are able to do dependency injection. And this dependency injection we have done with setter methods and constructors. In both the ways we can do the dependency injection into POSO classes. And these containers are capable to run all the POSOs like your controller POSOs, service POSOs, and DAOs. Whatever you implement, we implement as a POSO, and your IOC would be managing it. And dependency injection into which class? Into your POSO class. Whatever POSO you implement, either controller or service or DAO, all your developer inputs you can inject into POSO, right? All the developer feeds we can pass using dependency injection into our POSO class. We understand in how many ways we can do this. And container is having dependency injection support, as well as container can manage POSO life cycles. Okay, life cycles of POSO. We can have life cycles like init method and destroy methods into our POSO class. Init and destroy methods in our POSO class. If you have any initializations and cleanup operations using this lifecycle init method and destroy method, we could able to handle it. Okay, so up to now we are here, right? The next topic is stereotype annotations. Okay, stereotypes, very important one. Stereotypes. This is very important one. Okay, stereotypes. This is very important one. Okay, stereotypes, which is annotation approach I'm going to show you. Okay, stereotypes are annotations given. One is component one annotation, and the another one is controller and component controller, and we have at the rate service, and we have one more annotation name called at the rate repository. Okay, all these are stereotype annotations. Apart from this, we have rest controller and at the rate configuration. Okay, we'll talk about these two annotations later. Okay, so but these all are the stereotype annotations that we have, right? Component controller, service, repository, rest controller, and configuration. Okay, so for what need all these classes for what need all these annotations, where we need to use these annotations, and what is the benefit with it? Till now we understand that we implement our classes, right? We implement our classes, controller classes or service classes, as a simple posers. We understand that we are going to create them as a simple posers. We create them as simple posers, right? Poso controller for controller poso, and service For service, service pojo, and for repositories, repository pojo. Repository poses. Now we can able to configure these classes into XML file. We understand using XML approach, you can able to configure these classes using bean tags. Using bean tag, you can configure your controller class here, controllers, right? We can configure controllers, we can configure our service classes, right? We can configure all our repo classes, everything here. And if you have any dependency injection, that we know how to do the dependency injection one class into another. If repo want to inject into service or service wants to inject into controller, using reference type, we can inject it. In case if they have any simple strings or arrays as dependencies, we know how to inject them. So everything we are dealing with XML now. Everything we are dealing with XML. And these are three classes for one flow. If you consider, there you have one page, right? One UI page you have. For this UI page only, one page only, you have this implementation. If your application is having, if you consider, if your application is having 1,000 workflows, 1,000 use cases, or 1,000 plus pages you have. So for one page, you have one controller, one service, and one repo class. Similar way, if you have 1,000 plus UIs, so 1,000 plus UIs, if you have, you may need 1,000 plus controllers, services, and repository classes here. Okay, more or less 3,000 plus classes you required here. Okay, so 3,000 plus classes configuration you have to manage through XML file. If you have 3,000 plus classes, right here, plus 1,000 plus controller classes and 1,000 plus service classes and 1,000 plus repo classes. Okay, you need to maintain all that classes through XML, and you should be very much careful while creating their IDs and configuring the XML tags and everything, right? You should be very careful doing this configuration. So instead, for developer, right, again, it's a tough job to remember all the IDs if you are going to use bean IDs kind of thing, right? And it is very tough to configure all these 3,000 plus classes in XML file. And while doing modifications, you may delete existing tags that might impact your application also. So we should be very much careful on the existing code base as well while dealing with this XML. So instead of using XML, what they did from Spring 2x onwards, I believe, from Spring 2x onwards, they given stereotype annotations. Instead of configuring your classes, instead of configuring your classes using these bean tags in XML file, especially for your controller and service and repository classes, okay, they given stereotype annotations. What they are saying is, don't use this bean tag here, don't use this bean tag here until unless you have any configurations that you are unable to make through annotations. Through annotations, if you are not able to do anything, then go to XML, or else don't use any XML based configurations. You simply configure your class here. You simply configure your class here at the rate controller. Just on top of your controller, put this stereotype annotation. Put the stereotype annotation at the rate controller on your controller classes. On top of your service classes, use at the rate service. On top of your repository classes, use at the rate repository. Use these stereotype annotations. If you use these stereotype annotations, you need not to configure your poser classes into XML file. You need not to bring your classes here. Okay, your controller classes or service or repository classes, you need not to configure in XML file. All your 3,000 classes can be configured with these stereotype annotations. On top of all your classes, put this controller annotation, service and repository. While you started coding, right, just annotate with this annotation and do your business logic. You need not to worry about your XML configurations. Every developer need not to go to this XML and do the configurations, and you need not to interrupt XML files. Okay, so when you use these stereotype annotations, how they will work? When you use these stereotype annotations, your classes might be across all the packages, right? When you create an application something like this com.ds.web, here you might have all your controller classes, You created package web. Here you have all your controller classes under this web package, all your 1000 plus classes. Which classes? Controllers you have here, all your controllers you have here. And there is a package name called com.ds.service. All your 1000 plus services you have here, all your service classes. And com.ds.repo package. So all your repository classes being here considered, you have this many classes. Okay, all your services classes and repository classes or DAO classes. You can call DAOs or repositories. Okay, both are same. DAOs or repository classes. So this is how your classes packages are there. Okay, your all controllers are there in web package, and consider services are there in service package, and repositories are there in repository package. And here you are using stereotype annotations. You used @controller and @service and @repository. This is the annotation, class level annotation. Okay, repository. This class level annotation you have used on top of all the controller classes and services and DAOs. Now when you configure like this, right, who will create objects? So you implemented application. This is your app. You implemented this application. You implemented this application, and these all are your classes. Who will instantiate them? Okay, your IOC container only is responsible to instantiate. So what you need to do, you need to scan these packages through a configuration. In your Spring XML file, there is a namespace called context colon component hyphen scan. There is a tag name called component hyphen scan. Here we give the package name. Here we give package names. Okay, so what are all the packages we need to scan? com.ds.web. Okay, and com.ds.service, com.ds.repo. All your package names you need to pass here using this context colon component scan. This is the XML schema based configuration. Using this context colon component scan, we need to pass our base package name. We need to pass our base package name. We need to give our package name here. So whatever number of packages you have, you can do all the packages here. Or else what you can do, if you see the common parent root is com.ds for every package, com.ds. So you can give up to parent path. All these folders are there in com.ds folder only. If you see from the folder wise, com.ds is the parent package. You just give the parent package name here. So what will happen if I do this component scan base package? I created all my controllers, services and repositories, and I configured these classes into my XML file. I configured all these classes into my XML file. And when you load this XML file, into your IOC container, right, using application context, you can load this XML, that already we know, right? So when you load this and start it, when you load this and when you start IOC container, when you start this, what will happen? When you start your IOC container will scan this com.ds packages, all the packages which are there in this com.ds. This IOC will start scanning, like your antivirus scanning. When you scan antivirus, it will say scanning all the folders, right? Similar way, when you do IOC container start, it will scan only these packages com.ds. It will go to these packages and it will try to read all the classes which are there in your packages. This 1000 plus controllers and services, repositories we have, right? It will read all that classes if that class contains this annotation. Okay. Anyway, it will read all the classes and it will identify what are all the controllers, what are all the services, and what are all the repositories. It will read all your classes and it will instantiate them. It will create object for each and every class. It will create objects for each and every class. For your controller class, it will create objects. For your service, for your repository, all the objects will be created by your IOC container after scanning. So IOC will do what? When you have component scan, IOC will start scan all the packages. It will scan all the packages given in the XML path. Here in this XML, whatever the path we have given, right? It will scan all the packages. And as a second step, start scan all the packages. If it find any class with a stereotype annotation, any class with the stereotype annotation, we call them stereotypes, right? As I said, it will scan and it will find if any class, if it find any class with stereotype annotation, it will instantiate them. It will instantiate. It will create object for them. Automatically, it will create object. So earlier, what we used to do, we used to configure all the classes as a beans here. Now we are not even configuring one single bean here. So developer is safe now. He need not to worry about XML based configurations. He can directly focus on his development. He can just focus on his controller implementation, service and repository implementations. He need not to worry about the bean tags and the XML, right? He need not to worry about that configuration stuff. So automatically your container will go and pick all the classes. Earlier we used to configure classes here and we used to ask XML by loading your XML into IOC, we used to ask IOC container to create objects whichever beans I configured here. Now we are suggesting to IOC container, go and scan this package. We are saying to IOC container, you go and scan this package. There is a package com.ds. You go and scan this package. Inside this package, there are many controller service repository classes. Okay, you can consider them like a beans and create objects. Now IOC container will scan and then it will create objects. This is very simple approach. Okay, so how to deal with it? Let's see. New
Sir, what is mean by stereotype?
stereotype. Stereotypes. They named it. I really don't know the meaning of it. Okay, the package name is stereotype. They named it like a stereotype. You may search the definition from Google. Okay.
Yeah, same kind of things every time. It means something like that.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you find
Maybe, right. You see, instead of doing every configuration every time here, bean, right? Instead of doing that, they avoided lot of configuration stuff here, right? See, when we go for the the easier approach is when you find the difficulties. So earlier they started with XML and they found many difficulties here. Every time developer need to go there and do the configuration. What if we can automate it, right? In our regular day business, in our regular day tasks, if we find something that is repeatedly if you are doing, instead of doing it repeatedly, if you can automate it something, you know automatically it should able to do its job. This is some kind of the automating thing, right? Using this package name, IOC is going to pick up all the beans and it is able to create objects. Instead developer going and configuring it here, we automated it and IOC should able to go and read it. Okay, that difficulty we reduced here. Create a simple Java project. Create a Java project. Sixth one, stereotypes. Stereotype. I generally used to ask in interviews, right? While I'll ask what are all the stereotypes are available. Okay, so these all are the stereotypes. Whatever I mentioned, right? These all are the stereotypes which we use generally for creating objects, right? We annotate all our controllers with controller annotation, repositories with the repo annotation, service with service, right? And if there are any utilities, for utilities we use component. Okay, some utility classes we will have, right? So that utilities, validation utils, or any other utility, we use component. This is for particularly controller, and these are particularly for service or business classes, your business, and this is for DAO classes. And we use REST controller. This is also for controller, but it's a REST based controller. When you want to implement REST API, right, we use this. This is for REST API classes, and this is for pure configurations. If you have any configurations, configuration beans, I will say at the rate bean. Okay, configuration beans we configure using configuration. We discussed very in detail about this. Okay, configuration and REST controller we will see it in boot. Okay, we generally use this in boot. So here is my class. Go to build path, configure your jar files here. Okay, I'll create some package form.ds.web form.ds.service form.ds.repo, and for utilities consider you have one package util. Create classes here. I'm creating a web class controller. Okay, student controller. So if it is a controller, you need to annotate this with @controller annotation. Okay, for your understanding sake, I'll put a statement in constructor student controller object. When I try to create object, constructor would be executed, and you can see the statement. Okay, so same way, controller, then service, just rename it student service. So when it is a service, you need to use @service annotation. And for repo, student repo class. Student repo class, use @repository annotation. And if you have any utilities, create utility class here, student something util. For utilities, as I said, you need to use @component. Okay, now I have implemented, as a developer, I have implemented all my classes, my controller classes, my services, repositories, and utilities. As a Spring developer, I did this implementation. The implementation is ready. So how you can inform to your IOC container that I have implemented so and so class and that is available in so and so package? You need to configure that in a Spring XML file. You need to configure that class's path in Spring XML file. Go to your Spring XML here, and you need to use context to namespace. We need to use context to namespace for scanning your packages. Okay, we need to use context namespace to scan packages. First configure your schema here. Context schema I configured. This is my context schema XML namespace. And using this context schema, you need to scan your packages. You need to scan packages here. Scan packages. How do we scan? There is a context colon component scan. There is a tag name called context colon component scan. You see here they are saying component repository service controller stereotypes will be detected. It is saying scans the class path for annotated components that will be auto registered as a Spring Beans. By default, the Spring provided component repository service controller. So when you configure your package here, root package, it will scan all the classes and it will register like a beans. Earlier, we used to configure that beans here. Now we are automating it. If you configure your classes with stereotype annotations and if you give package name here, automatically all your classes will be registered into IOC. Now just load your XML file and see it. Will that really creating objects or not? See this? Repo object created, service created, utilities created, controller created. Okay, so it is not bothering any order here. See, repo created first, service next, then util, then controller. So run it again. Will this follow same order? Yes. So the first priority giving to repository classes, then services, then utilities, then controller. So in a order it is creating. Generally, this is how we will have, right? Even in the application also, we implement. Generally, we will not start from controllers, right? So whatever DB implementations we have, we do first. Then we auto-wire the DB into service and we do service implementations. Finally, the service we will auto-wire into controller and controller implementations we do. Implementation will start from back to front. This is how I generally follow. Few people will follow this up way also. Controllers they implement in service, then repositories. But the best approach is reverse way because these all are dependencies. Repository is dependency for service, service is dependency for controller. Basically, dependencies we implement first. So similar way, container also is doing what? First, it is creating dependency objects, then it is creating the class which is depending on that. So that is the order it is following. So that is the reason it is creating first repos, then service, then utilities, then controllers. Are we clear? Any doubts from the stereotypes?
No, yes, clear.
Yeah. So basically the burden, right? Lot of burden reduced from the developer. If you imagine when you have lot many classes and configurations through XML, it's very tough thing to manage, right? If we delete something or if you don't follow some tag conventions, right? So many things they avoided from XML, but now question is here. Now the question starts here, right? Earlier we did a dependency injection. Earlier we did dependency injection. Now how you are going to do the dependency injection here? Earlier we did lot of dependency injection. You said everything you can pass from XML file so that we could able to pass anything from XML at runtime. But now what about this dependency injection? If your class, if it have any dependencies, how you can deal it? Still you can use your Spring XML file if you want to pass any dependencies. Okay, still you can use. Let's say I have utility class. In this utility class you have some properties, so only this particular class you can remove this component annotation and configure that here. Okay, so if you have any simple primitive dependencies, most of the times we will not have primitive dependencies. If we have any such, okay, if we have any such, we can pass that primitives from properties file. Okay, Yeah, let me show you. Now, as we move to stereotype annotations, in case if you want to do the dependency injection, how to handle that? I want to inject repository into service. I want to inject service into controller. How I can deal with it, right? So for this one, they given one annotation name called auto-wired. They given one annotation name called @auto-wired. @auto-wired annotation they have given. So if you use this @auto-wired annotation, auto-wired annotation by default it will do automatic dependency injection. Auto-wired annotation is for auto dependency injection. Auto dependency injection. The stereotype annotations and this auto-wired annotation, you know, they are very important annotations. Regularly we use. Okay, regularly we use this auto-wired annotation and all the stereotype annotations which we use, right? Controller, service, repository. Only we deal most of the times. Most of the times we deal with these annotations. Okay. Now, how this auto-wired annotation works? As I said, I have here many classes. Here I have many classes, many controllers, services, and repositories. Consider here I have a class. Consider this as a controller. Okay, class car. Consider this is your controller. I have a car class. So if it is a controller, you know what annotation you need to use. On top of your class, you need to use @controller. Consider this is like a controller, okay? And I have a one more class here, engine. So I have one more class called engine. So consider this is like your service. And have one more class called fuel. Treat it as a repository. Treat it as a repository. Okay. Now one class is having dependency on another class. Your controller is having dependency of engine, and engine is having dependency of fuel. So how we can do the dependency injection? Fuel first we need to inject into engine. Fuel. How to inject it? To inject this fuel, right? You need not to use any XML property tag or constructor tag. Just use @auto-wired on top of your fuel property. Even you don't need any setter and getter methods also here. See, lot of things we are avoiding here. In earlier example, what we avoided, lot of bean tags we avoided. Now, when you want to do the dependency injection, you need not to configure anything in XML file. So I have engine dependency here. On top of engine, also put @auto-wired. So when you put auto-wired, how it works? What we avoided before is this bean tags we avoided completely. Bean ID we used to configure our controller class here. Bean ID some controller. Then we used to inject engine into this car class by using setter or constructor. Here we used to use property, right? And property reference we used to pass the engine class reference. Like this we used to pass. So we avoided almost all the bean tags. These bean tags we need not to configure because we have these stereotypes. When we use this stereotype, that bean tag is completely avoided. Then what about this dependency injection? This dependency injection is there. When I avoid bean tag, I'm losing my property way of dependency injection feature here. Earlier I used to be able to inject it using property tag, whatever bean I want. But now you completely remove this bean tag, then where I need to do the dependency injection. So for this property tag also, right? For this property or constructor, whatever dependency injection we were doing, right? For the dependency injection, they directly given annotation name called auto-wired. You simply configure auto-wired annotation on top of your required property, without the setter and getters also. From Java side also, if you see, there is no setter method or constructor required here. Lot of code, if you see, setter methods are avoided here. There is no setter method or no constructor is required. So completely This tags has removed, and here setter methods also removed. As a developer, you need to do what? Just you need to implement your classes with stereotypes, and wherever this class is having dependencies, just you need to create that class dependencies with auto-aware annotation. That's it. Dependency injection will take care by your IOC container. Your IOC container will do what? While doing component scan, right? As we see the order, first it created this repository classes. First, your classes objects will be created. All your repository objects will be created, and it will create engine class object, all your service class objects. If it find any class with AutoWire, you know what it will do? It will check in its container whether this AutoWire bean is available or not. So already this repository bean is created, right? Whatever created, that bean automatically it will inject here. And once after creation of service object is fully created, engine object created with AutoWire beans also. Now this one will be injected here directly into car class object it will create, and it will inject it. That is the beauty of AutoWire annotation. See here, we have multiple classes, right? Repository I want to inject into service, you can do that. Just you need to do what? Student repo at the rate, sorry, AutoWire. You just need to put at the rate AutoWire. So it will be injected here. As I don't have any methods, I couldn't able to show you how to call it. So let me add one method here. Student repo. Okay, into repo again I injected. Okay, not repo. So repo is basically for CRUD operations, right? Public void save something, save student. So I want to pass some data here. Int ID, string name. This is my repository. I want to save some data. Okay. So just to create a list. I'm not connecting with any database. Okay. I'll just create a simple list here. Into that list, I will add. I'll create one poser class to add my data. Please tell me guys if I'm running fast. Okay. I can slow myself. Name, email, address. This is simple bean class. Okay, this is simple bean class which is using for CRUD operations. Okay, you need not to bother about this bean class using Spring. A simple bean which is not at all related to Spring. Okay, plain bean class I have here which is not at all related to your Spring. So I have a list here just to store objects, array list. So save student. I'll just here get a student as an input, and I'll save it into my list.add. System.out.println save success. Save student success. Okay, now I want to call this save student method from my service. Generally repositories will call from services. Okay, in architecture controller will call services, service will call repositories. So now this repository is dependency in my service class. What you need to do to call that service class methods, you need to create your service class dependency here at the rate AutoWire. So this will be injected here. Now consider you have a method here, public void create student, a student object you are getting here, and you are saving by calling repo class save student method. So here also if you want to put some statement, create student. So first repository implementation is done, then service implementation. In this service I injected my repository object, okay, using auto-void, and I am using that here directly, repository dot save student. So I could able to call this repository class save student method. Now I want to inject this service into controller to call create student method. Annotate this one also with @auto-void public void controller, right? So any controller method, consider something REST or create student API. This is my API method. So user will pass from UI. User will pass the student object from UI, and I want to call my service create method. So the service create method will call repository save method. So finally controller is calling service, service is calling repository. So here if you want to put some statement in controller, add that statement here, create student API. Okay, so all my implementation is done first. I created controller, I created service, and I created repo. Now repo is injected into service using auto-void. Now service injected into controller, again using auto-void. Dependency injection only happening here. Earlier what we used to do, we used to have setter method, and in XML file using by calling property reference, we used to inject it. Now all that stuff not required. Just keep your class reference here with auto-void. No setters, no getters, no beans, no property tags. Now you are scanning anyway, you are scanning the packages, so it will create objects. And as well as if you want to activate annotations, right? To activate annotations, you need to use annotation config so that it will activate your auto-void annotation also. Done. Now my classes implementation is done. And if you want to call student controller, call the student controller here, cap dot get bean of student controller. Now call student controller dot create student. You need to pass student object. So for the API, we generally pass it from Postman or from our UI. So consider you are passing here data student ID 123 student dot set name set email. What else we have? Set address. Now call it. First, your objects are creating. Okay, repo object created, service created, util created, controller created. Now when I call create API, which is controller method, this controller method is internally calling student create student service method. Finally, create student service method is calling save student repository method. See, first API calling, then service calling, then repository calling. How we are able to calling it? If you visit your controller class, in your controller class you have only service reference, but you don't have actual object. Object we did not create it. Whatever container created, that object injected here. Okay, how it is injected? As you mentioned, auto-void. So if you don't auto-wire it, and if you again try to run your application without auto-wiring it, if you try to run your application and try to save the data, so you called API trying to call service, it is getting null pointer exception as the service object is not there. Service object container created, but we are not asking container to pass that object here. When you enable it using auto wait, then it will inject here. Otherwise, you will get null pointer exception. See this? You are getting null pointer exception because object is not there. Object there with container, but we did not inject it. When you use auto wait, then container will inject. Now you could able to run it. First, it will call API. Here, the first call will come. Then from here, it will go here. Second call will come here. Then from here, we are calling this one, repository. The third call will come here, which is there in repo. See this? First call going to API, API to service, and service to repo. Objects created, dependency injection also happened. What we need as a developer, we need not to worry about any beans configuration. We need not to worry about any beans configuration, and we need not to worry about auto wiring also. Earlier, see what we did for achieving this. Earlier, what we did, we have done so much configuration here. When we have dependency, right? When we have such dependencies, right? See, we created customer objects and we injected that customer objects into whatever required bean class using references. This much configuration we have done. Now almost zero configuration. We don't see anything in XML. Objects are created automatically and dependency injection also happened automatically, right? So these are the advantages with the stereotypes and auto-aware annotation. Okay, we'll go. There are XML concepts also for this auto-wearing. For interview sake, we will discuss them in the next session. Okay, but we are not going to use that XML based auto-wearing anywhere. Okay, in next session we will discuss them. Any doubts so far?
No, Naveen.
Yeah, just get this example and try to run on your missions. Okay, you will get to understand. So do let me know if I am running fast or if you have any understanding here. Okay.
I mean, I was facing one issue while implementing the spin win cycle.